Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris coming to you live from central Pennsylvania for a special feature today with my guest, Miranda Melcher and Dr. Colin Robinson. Miranda is in the UK, somewhere deep in a bunker beneath the Thames River. We won't say where, we don't disclose her whereabouts. MI5 is looking for her as we speak. And Dr. Colin Robinson is in New Zealand, the land where we were told COVID was exterminated, but it's made its ugly appearance reappear, unfortunately, for the Kiwis. Sorry to hear about that in New Zealand, but COVID is back, at least a small number of them. Welcome, folks. Welcome for tuning in. Let me just go ahead and get started here very quickly and let you know that my guest, we're going to talk about what's happening in Mozambique, and we're going to do it starting with historical perspective. It's important to understand contemporary events in Mozambique. We have to go back to 1992 when the civil conflict that started in 1975 finally ended. And Mozambique was virtually destroyed, ladies and gentlemen. It was at such a low base of development. So much of the country had been utterly destroyed, the infrastructure, what little there was by the conflict, and such a mess that we have to start from there. And Miranda's going to help us get from there and move forward. Colin is a subject matter expert on Africa as well, on security issues. And we'll probably mix in here some talk about the military and restructuring military and security sector reform, issues like that, because they do play a role in what's happening in Mozambique, or at least they certainly should. I think we're going to determine from this conversation. So with that, I'm going to let each of my guests give a quick introduction to who they are, and I'll start with Miranda since she's on top, and ladies first. So Miranda, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Hiya. Well, thanks for having me, Chris. This is a great opportunity to talk about Mozambique, both the history and how it's relevant today. I am in London, currently in the last year of my PhD at King's College London in Defence Studies, where I look at post-conflict military integration, both the writing and implementation of peace treaties, focusing specifically on Angola and Mozambique. So hopefully I can bring that expertise into the discussion today.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so I should say before we go any further, if you're curious, that's not a KZN accent that she's got there. It's also not a Kentucky accent. Sounds a little Scottish, but it's not really Scottish. She is a citizen of the world, having lived all over the world, kind of like myself, although I did have my upbringing in the United States, so I have that Midwest accent. But anyway, so we're not going to disclose where she's really from or which multiple passports she may or may not hold, but we'll leave it at that. Anyway, so Miranda, welcome into the stream. We appreciate your presence today. All right, so Colin, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself? I know that we had you back on the channel, I think it was in May when you were on, and since then, well, you've been pretty busy in New Zealand and things have changed a little bit there. But so tell folks, because not everybody caught that stream. Oh, your mic is on mute because I actually put on mute. That's my bad. Still on mute.
There we are.
There we go.
Hello, hello. Yes. Yes, things have been busy in New Zealand. Trump was happy enough to tell the whole world that we'd had a massive resurgence in cases. We had approximately 9 new cases. I since 2008 and various trips around the world with the United Nations and doing think tanky things, I have been looking at reconstructing armies, primarily in Africa. I have spent time looking at Liberia, Somalia, Congo. Also did some work in East Timor and Georgia. I went on to do some work for the New Zealand Defence Force in our military operational headquarters, and have just come back from 2 years working in Nairobi on advising on the proper support for the Somali National Army. So my expertise here is very much generally how to go into Africa, or what has happened when Westerners have tried to go into Africa and rebuild armies. And generally the results have not been good, because it's a bit hard to have a strong army in a weak country.
Now, I should excuse me. I should mention to folks that I'm one of those Westerners that's gone in Africa and rebuilt armies, which Colin has researched, and so yeah, Colin's smiling and I'm smiling, so it probably won't be that antagonistic, at least that discussion. But no, I'm one of the folks. In fact, that's how we got to meet. Colin and I met about 12 years ago or something like that, I think it is now, as a consequence of research he was doing on his dissertation, and I was doing security sector reform in Liberia with the Armed Forces Liberia. So Miranda's got background here in researching these sort of things. Colin's been doing it as well, and I've been a practitioner as well as an academic on this topic, so I'm on both sides of the fence. So I guess I get some of the blame, and maybe I could take some of the credit. We'll see what happens. But anyway, so Miranda, why don't we go ahead and get started, and let's kind of just give people, if you can, a quick, couple minutes of Mozambique. Yeah, we know it was a Portuguese colony. In fact, the Portuguese considered to be part of Portugal, an integral part of Portugal, like Angola, not really a colony, but part of their country. They were probably wrong in that assessment, but that's how they felt. And then it got its independence after the revolution in Portugal in 74, 75 becomes independent, and it descends into chaos. And can you just take us, if you want to talk about that, that's fine, but just to frame it for people, because not everybody knows. Some folks were born after 75, so they're not really aware of that. But 92 is the important date. So if we could just kind of frame it so we can go from there.
Yeah. So I think the Portuguese piece of it is a bit important, and I think you're completely correct, right? Portugal did see all of its colonies as an integral part of the country, but not as equal members, not as equal parts. And so they were very much considered integral, but in relatively a similar way that, for example, the US historically saw native territory as integral, as a place to take things from, not necessarily to consider as equal parts. And so pretty much the entire systems that were set up in Angola and Mozambique were for the purposes of extracting anything the Portuguese found useful to Portugal. And that meant that on independence, what industry that there was, what infrastructure that there was, what education existed, what political organization existed, first of all, there wasn't very much. And second, it was essentially geared towards extractive everything. And so although in Mozambique's case, the transition to independence was relatively straightforward, what this meant was that the party that took over, Frelimo, didn't have a lot to work with in terms of being an independent country. Now, this ended up being exacerbated by a whole bunch of things, mainly Frelimo deciding to join the Soviet bloc and implementing really harsh communist agriculture policies, which, as we know now, are not a great way to build a strong economy. And so it was in this sort of environment that the civil war and violence really started to pick up. And some of the actual themes around that original violence are actually still relevant today. There was and still is a pretty big divide between the center, the capital city, and the rest of the country. That's been exacerbated in recent decades between the south, where the capital city is located, and then the north. This is building on the legacy of lack of colonial development. This is building on the legacy of there being very little infrastructure and educational opportunity in more rural areas. So some of the conditions that created grievance and violence from 1970, well, the late 1970s onwards, some of them are not as relevant, right? The Soviet Union's not a thing anymore. But some things like center versus rural, some things like where the infrastructure is and where industries are based and who gets the money from that, those are actually still grievances that are relevant. And so although we did have peace in 1992, this was prompted in a lot of ways by war weariness to a degree, right? The war had been going on for quite a long time. It was pretty notoriously violent for civilian populations in particular. What little infrastructure there had been was pretty significantly destroyed. And of course, the government, Frelimo, was incentivized to begin to negotiate by the fact that their patron, the Soviet Union, if we're talking 1992, Soviet Union's not going to be helping you out anymore.
Yeah, you lost that big source of support when the Soviet Union folded up its tent. But Miranda, if I can interrupt for just a second. So it sounds like it's kind of a classic tale of colonialism in which the colony is there to support the metropolitan and the resources are extracted for the benefit of the metropolitan rather than, say, for the folks in the indigenous who are in the colony. And that's kind of the legacy that's left over when the Portuguese leave, and you're going to get to that in a second. And when they leave, they kind of just leave. Well, they do a little damage, some of them too, but when they leave, there's not much for them to hang on to. I mean, famously, like in the Congo, I think there were like 3 university graduates in the Congo when the Belgians left.
About 15, but yes, not many. Not many for a country that size.
All right, I was off by 12. No.
It's not much.
No, it's not much at all. So the point of what you're making here, you're telling this narrative right now, is that Miranda, is that a lot of the legacy problems still exist, and they arose in that time frame. So I'll let you continue. Sorry, I just want to make that point about the metropolitan.
No, so it's really important, right? Because what that meant was that the only real sort of center that was developed was the capital city, and that's where Frelimo took over on independence. And a lot of those divides between the few bits that were industrialized and the bits that were not continue to this day, despite the fact that for quite a while after the peace treaty was formally signed in 1992, Mozambique looked from the outside like it was making a lot of economic progress. But that actually sort of masks some pretty significant divides that are built on top of these colonial legacies. And so it wouldn't be fair to say that the problems today are exactly what the Portuguese left behind. That would be an oversimplification, but neither is it actually entirely removed from those structures and legacies that were essentially not built. That was kind of the beginning of the problem.
It's interesting you say that.
If I can just drop.
Go ahead, Colin. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I can just ask a question here, Miranda. The one of the things you haven't gotten into is there are a lot of things to get into, but one of the things we haven't quite gotten into is the two parties to the 1980s Civil War and where they fitted in, and what the heritage of maybe even the South Africans creating Renamo. Yeah. So if you could just sketch in a tiny bit of both the two parties to the war that ended in 1992.
Sure. So Frelimo has been the government since independence. They were founded in the 60s by some of the few Mozambicans who had been educated in what we would consider sort of formal education, who were generally in exile, and formed Frelimo along with, I mean, remember this is the 60s, right? This is the wave of decolonization across Africa. This is the rise of Pan-Africanism. Many of these liberation parties across much of the continent were formed by these kinds of people in these meetings, right? They all have links to each other. And so that was very much the sort of heritage of Frelimo, that then, as again, other independence parties did in other parts of the continent, gained power and decided to go communist. That is a story that we've seen elsewhere. And some elements of that tradition have remained, not really the communist bits, but the idea of Frelimo as the party of independence, Frelimo as the party that has been in government, has been in power since 1975. Those are structures and legacies that still are very relevant today and are even still part of how the party sort of frames its message, and is one of the key things to understand about this lack of separation between what we see in Mozambique today between the state and the party. They are technically different things. They are different things on paper, but one has been the other for such a long time. And the attempts in the peace agreement and since to decentralize power more have really not come to very much. And that's in fact one of the big grievances behind the violence now. And then the other side is Renamo, which we still don't know a lot about in terms of its early beginnings, or at least we have lots of people who say they know what happened, and yet they directly contradict each other. So that was one of the parts of my research, for example, that got very contentious very quickly, because there's sort of the one side that says that Renamo was created entirely by South Africa and Rhodesia, and was essentially a group of a few hundred disaffected Mozambicans who were entirely the puppets of the South African apartheid regime. And then there are others who say that, well, actually they were disaffected and genuine political actors who happened to get help from South Africa and Rhodesia. Where the truth lies is still an open question. But I think the important thing to understand about Renamo is that they have always been the underdog, always. They have pretty much always been based in rural Mozambique. They have, during the war in particular, a long tradition of forcibly coercing or kidnapping people to join them. Generally very low standards of education, even up to the senior leadership. There were some pretty reasonable questions about whether their longtime leader, Alfonso de Clama, could read. That actually came up in the interviews I did about the actual peace negotiations themselves. And one of the reasons perhaps that there were delays was around literacy. So these are not necessarily the same kinds of backgrounds and the same sorts of experiences that Frelimo has. And so although we've technically had peace since 1992, there's still some pretty fundamental differences between who is in these groups, who they say they represent, and the kinds of goals that they say they have.
Yeah, no, it's actually it's an important point to make there, because Renamo has remained in opposition throughout the post-conflict political development of the country, and that at times has caused some fractious political relations at different times. But there's a couple points you talked about here a little bit ago. Let me go back, Miranda. And before I do that, let me just let my audience know, because a number of people just come into the stream. Folks, you're listening to Chris Wyatt Africa on the Daba Africa channel. My special feature guests today are Miranda Melcher, a PhD candidate from King's College in the UK, a citizen of the world, though. She's not from the UK, even though she sounds kind of Scottish. Anyway, and also you see here at the Brady Bunch view with people on top, one on the bottom. At the bottom, there's Dr. Colin Robinson from NZ, from New Zealand, the dreaded home of the All Blacks. I mean, the home of the dreaded All Blacks. Sorry about that. New Zealand's a wonderful place. Maybe not so much the All Blacks, but
yes, we just beat you thoroughly whenever you decide to sort of pop up.
Well, of course, the problem with that, Colin knows, is I'm a Springbok fan, and we just won the World Cup. By the way, but out of sympathy for New Zealand, I am wearing a Auckland Blues rugby jersey today, my only New Zealand jersey. That's my thing on the thing. I always wear rugby jerseys for those who don't know. But anyway, so that's who you're listening to, folks. We're talking about what's happening in Mozambique. But in order to understand what's happening in Mozambique and in Cabo Delgado province, you really need to turn time back. And Miranda was helping us frame that, starting out the conversation. So every now and then, folks, my guests in here, I'll mention to people, because the audience grows and shrinks, people come and go, so I'll mention it. But so let's get back to a couple things you were talking about there, Miranda. You were talking about basically uneven economic development and growth that's happened since '92, and that will play a big role in what we're going to get to if we get up to north there. But here's the thing too, is that when the conflict ended, Mozambique, as I alluded to, was destroyed. I mean, there wasn't much of anything. I mean, not that there had been a whole lot of infrastructure to begin with, because the focus wasn't on developing the colony. It was on feeding the metropole, as we talked about back in Portugal. So what there was largely destroyed by this violent conflict, as you talked about, between Renamo and Frelimo that took place, the Civil War. And a lot of people, it became the darling of the IMF and the World Bank for a period of years in the 1990s. Look at Mozambique, it's growing 8, 10, 12% per year. And I would look at this and go, well, yeah, from nothing. If you have $100, it's easy to grow to 108. It's a lot harder if you have 100 billion to grow to 108 billion. So they were growing from a low base. And as you mentioned, it's uneven. And I think that's an important consideration too, because despite 30 years of economic growth, not the entire period, but most of that period we've seen economic growth in Mozambique, it is still a desperately poor and underdeveloped country, and quite a large country. Is that fair to say, Miranda?
Yeah, so that's actually really fair to say. And there's something that's really important there, right? The darling of the IMF.
Yeah.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think all international organizations are evil. However, the IMF's...
The CSTO, maybe?
Yeah. The IMF's actions in Mozambique are really important to understand, because they do create on paper what looks like this amazing economic development that actually has had some pretty significant consequences, both now, but actually the problems were visible almost immediately, which is that the IMF came in initially before the war even ended, right? Because Frelimo realized that the Soviet economy wasn't working, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and started, as many previously Soviet allies did it in the late 80s, early 90s, reaching out to the World Bank, reaching out to the IMF saying, help us. And as we know, the World Bank and the IMF do help with conditions. And those conditions became increasingly apparent once peace was signed, as foreign investors started seeing Mozambique as peaceful enough to be safe to invest in. But what they wanted to invest in were industries that would work on the global economy. And so we actually went from an extractive-based economy under Portugal in colonialism to an export-based economy under the IMF in the late 90s. And the industries were a bit different. One of the really big ones that the IMF sort of set up was around certain types of farming. Cashew nuts were a big one. But the underlying impact was essentially the same. There was no actual holistic development of the Mozambican economy. It was really heavily focused on specific export-focused industries. And this meant that, first of all, of course, deals are still going through the central government, which enriches the government, enriches urban areas, but has a harder time trickling out to the rural parts of the country, which is most of the country. It does not create massive amounts of jobs. And so what you end up with is, on paper, Mozambique looks great. The ports and the urban areas are developing exponentially faster than anyone could have imagined. the quality of life in those places does actually significantly increase. And yet even the IMF was admitting by 2003, 2004, that 80% at least of the country lived on less than $2 a day. Yeah. And so as much as that was admitted and known, starting in 1997, people were writing about it. By 2004, the IMF is admitting it. That actually fundamental economic inequality has in fact not significantly changed. And it's one of the, I think, fundamental underlying causes of the violence that we're seeing in the North today, around this idea of economic inequality, lack of political autonomy, and essentially the idea that the government doesn't care about either of those problems.
Well, I think this is
Miranda, if I can jump in just for half a second, can you talk a little bit about the situation in the rest of the subsistence rural economy, and anything about roads to market, getting the produce down into the more urban areas?
So, I mean, this is, again, the same thing that happened under colonialism, is that the transport networks that were rebuilt after the war were fundamentally based on which transport networks were necessary for export. And so it's not as bad as it was during colonialism, certainly at all. But there are some odd things. Anyone who's ever seen a map of Mozambique would understand that north-south is the axis along which transport and communication makes the most sense. And yet some of the key railways are still east-west, which doesn't make a massive amount of sense for a long, skinny country. So we still have issues there. We have issues around air becomes one of the main ways to transport. And yet, as we've seen just this week, one of the reasons that was given for the Mozambican military from retreating from Cabo Delgado was that they couldn't receive reinforcements by air because the nearest town that they did control didn't have a landing strip that could support the planes. So we're still seeing that infrastructure and transport is an issue. And with the subsistence economy, that has continued, and in fact was not particularly well thought out by the people that implemented the peace treaty, as actually there was a scheme to try and scatter the former combatants across the whole country. But it did not actually take into account the fact that most of the jobs were only in the urban areas, and that many combatants were not prepared to go back to subsistence farming. And so there ended up being a sort of mismatch between what international donors kind of thought was going to happen and what ended up being the economic realities on the ground.
Yeah, we've seen this before in other locations. For instance, Angola, also a former Portuguese colony or integral part of Portugal that doesn't matter to Portugal. But we've seen this before, in which, when the elections took place in '92, I believe it was also around that time frame, the U.S. Air Force from U.S. Air Forces Europe sent C-130 aircraft down to Angola to fly. I think it was 80 or 100,000 former fighters from the MPLA, UNITA, and even FNLA back to their home provinces so they could vote at home and go back there. But they got back there and they voted. And of course, the fighting started shortly after that because Joseph Savimbi didn't like the outcome. But even if they got back there, the question that was asked by people thinking ahead of the time was that, okay, now people have gone home, but there's no jobs. What are they going to do? So you've relocated them. So that makes a good point about what you're saying there. But back to the economy. So instead of the World Bank is providing this assistance, and we'll get to HIPC a little bit later on, but the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. But basically what was happening is that you had a new version, and this is, I guess, where I don't like the term neocolonialism, but it's out there. And I guess you could make the argument in Mozambique's case that intentionally or otherwise, this is sort of a neocolonialist model for the economy where it was still extractive and going to, even though it was exported to the rest of the world, not necessarily to the metropolitan. When what really needed to happen is either separately or at least in concert with this was an effort to develop entrepreneurialism and a services-based economy and employment and infrastructure inside the country so that Mozambicans could get consumer goods and they could get employment and they could get services. They could go get their shoes repaired or they didn't have mobile phones then, but you get my point. Get your mobile phone repaired, things like that. So that really was not the focus. And I suspect we're probably suffering in many respects from that even to this day.
Yeah. And in fact, it's even worse than, you couldn't go get your shoes repaired. Even by 1999, Frelimo itself was publicly unable to pay the wages of most of its civil servants.
Ouch.
So the export focus was actually so extreme that at least in the early years, and this did change later on, but at least in the early years, even the Frelimo government in power had trouble paying its own people. And this also had knock-on effects for the integrated military, which directly leads to the problems we're seeing today. And I'm happy to go into the integrated military and why it fell apart. But essentially, even Frelimo didn't necessarily benefit at the beginning. That has, of course, changed. Though if we're making comparisons to Angola, I would at least not go so far to say that Frelimo is nearly as corrupt as the MPLA.
Oh, good Lord, no, I don't. Yeah, not even going to go there. So we'll jump forward from that stage in a second, but I want to get Colin in here very quickly. Colin, we've seen similar situations in other countries in Africa where we wind up having a security crisis or it devolves into civil war when we see former colonial powers leave and opposing sides resort to conflict. We mentioned, of course, Angola took place there. Are there any parallels you can think of for Mozambique along these lines post-conflict that have had a similar sort of development path? Or maybe an example where one's gone better?
Oh, sorry, you're talking about other comparisons in Africa.
Yeah.
I have been working on. I've been looking at cases. Well, I started with about 14 to 15 cases from my PhD across the world, looking at this reconstruction of an army in the presence of an international force. Mm-hmm. And in the last couple of years, looking at this kind of stuff, I have stopped using the term post-conflict because the conflict generally doesn't end.
Yeah.
What we have is a large amount of international interest and money and pressure and whatnot. Sometimes a deeply unhelpful push to a flimsy settlement, and then the whole thing starts up again. We have problems in the Eastern Congo, in Mali, in North, in all the bits of Sudan, South Sudan. We never had a proper coherence in Somalia. In Liberia, yes, exactly. Yes, there may be some vague hopeful signs in Liberia and Sierra Leone. The wars have not quite restarted. There are all kinds of problems, including the election of a completely unqualified president in Liberia in 2018.
What are you talking about?
The wars
He's a fantastic.
Actually haven't restarted.
I take exception. He's a wonderful soccer player. What are you talking about? He's not qualified to be president.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe we can just form a group of what I suggest, Chris, is actually we get all your stream viewers and we send them out to be presidents of all these African countries, because on that basis we'd have some amazing presidents.
I think we could do worse. I mean, better than some current sitting presidents in Africa. I think that's the argument you're making there. That's funny. Colin, thanks for that feedback. That's good stuff. So Miranda, let's I guess we'll move forward a little bit. Before we do that, there's one thing I should mention here too, and get your perspective, and Colin, you can jump on this too after Miranda responds, is that one element of this we didn't really focus on, but it's important for the historical context, is that in the midst of the Portuguese withdrawing, the conflict, a civil war breaking out between Renamo and Frelimo inside of Mozambique, we also have the reality that the Rhodesians have a conflict ongoing, a liberation war taking place there. And you see the Zulu scouts and Rhodesian light infantry crossing the border. And you see at some point when Frelimo takes over that they sponsor and host Robert Mugabe's Bush army with thousands and thousands. And we see cross-border raids. And that wreaks havoc along the eastern border, well, maybe the western border for Mozambique, but the eastern border of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And that also has a major impact on development, and it affects things like the Cohabasa Dam up north, which is critically important for power generation and revenue and such. So that conflict goes on along the border until 1980, and then it finally tamps down, and then the focus is inside of Mozambique. But all of that played a role in what happened here. So I think we probably still see some of the impact of that all these years later as well.
Yeah, we also see, I mean, generally the issue with all of these, we have with Malawi as well, is spillovers of refugee populations, and then the issue of when the war ends, where did the refugees go? Who's taking care of them? What kind of economic help do they get? And this, of course, impacts all of these different countries because people are fleeing over borders both ways pretty consistently. I would say it's probably not necessarily as bad as refugee flow problems between the DRC, Rwanda, and Burundi, for example. but it's still sort of worth considering that these borders are porous, and the idea that the South African development community, for example, is paying attention to current events in Mozambique, that's not random, and that's not necessarily altruistic. There are some real concerns over potential spillover, both historically and potentially today.
Colin, have you got something you can add there about the Rhodesian impact to Mozambique? Anything make sense to add to that?
Just that the just going back into this question, just reflecting the couple of things that Miranda highlighted, the questions about how much it was a local movement, or how much Renamo was a local movement, and how much was external movement. No, nothing in particular. When I've been looking at Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, I've always been looking at a little later as the peace settlement had been done, and trying to stick together the Rhodesian security forces with the two Zimbabwean groups.
All right, so I'm not gonna keep Colin on the back foot all the time, because I've asked him second, puts him at a disadvantage because everybody else gets to get their points out. So I'm going to ask him directly on the question first, coming up next. But before I get to that, folks, you're listening to Chris Wyatt Africa on the Indaba Africa channel here in Central Pennsylvania. My guests today for the special feature are Miranda Melcher, who's in London, and Dr. Colin Robinson, who's in New Zealand. Even though he sounds kind of Australian today, I think he has a cold. Anyway, so thanks for tuning in, folks. We've got about 80 folks currently watching the program. Thank you for tuning in. I am seeing the chat over here, but and I appreciate the comments, but I hadn't really seen anything that was really a question directed towards the guest, so I've not added those in. But I see Brett's comments about Burundi and others talking about Angola. But let's shift the conversation a little bit here. So the war has ended, and we're going to move forward a little bit. And we have this peaceful settlement. But then, of course, there's got to be a military. And I think this is something not a lot of people know about. So maybe you and Colin can contribute. We'll start with Colin. So in 92, the war ends. And, in South Africa famously took all the Bantustan forces plus the armed wing of the Pan-African Congress, as well as the Mkhonto weSizwe, and we merged them into the South African National Defense Force. And we went from 60 to 165,000 overnight. Of course, they shrank down quickly after that. But what happened with the forces in Mozambique? Were they also merged, Colin? Did that sort of thing take place? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Actually, just hang on just a moment here.
I can start.
No, go ahead, Miranda. Go ahead, because I'll let Colin.
Please go ahead, Miranda. I'll comment after you if you like.
Sorry, I was just trying to be fair to my guests and not keep everybody in the back foot. Miranda, you go ahead and start it off, and then we got a question from Brett here after you guys answer.
Cool. So in Mozambique, they did create an integrated military. This was renamed, given new uniforms, and was originally meant to be 50-50 between Frelimo and Renamo. This was what was hashed out quite difficult. It was quite a difficult negotiation by all accounts, but this is what was agreed on. And it started, as with many of these processes, with setting up assembly areas, combatants from each side going into the assembly areas, registering, giving up their weapons, and then deciding, saying whether they wanted to join the new military or become civilians. And what actually was interesting is that way fewer combatants on both sides wanted to join the new military. And so it was meant to be 15,000 from each side. It ended up being about 8,000 from Frelimo and about 3,000 to 4,000 from Renamo. So both the numbers were different and the ratio was different. And the idea was, okay, they're going to go off and be their new army. A little bit of training was arranged, not a whole lot. They did have a bunch of negotiations around how rank, salary, those sorts of things would be negotiated. Anyone who's been in the military, everyone I've ever talked to has said that rank matters a hell of a lot more than necessarily how much you're actually paid. Sure. So that was a real sticking point in the negotiations. But that was sort of resolved. But the problem is that from that moment on, from the swearing in of the new soldiers, the new uniforms, all of this, is it was sort of assumed, okay, great, now that's sorted. Turns out, not so much.
Psych. Yeah, there you go. So that's I think it's important. It's a very interesting thing that you note. And back then, I knew about Mozambique, but I wasn't what you call a subject matter expert on Mozambique back in the early 1990s. And I was always curious at the time why having these huge forces reportedly. Renamo had at least 8 to 12,000 fighters in the bush, and Frelimo had 15 to 20,000 or something like that. How we wind up with a military 8,000, I didn't know if it was a consequence they didn't have the funding, but it turns out, as you said, a lot of people probably were tired of this nonsense and wanted to do something else, and that's probably why you had a lot less people convert over. That makes a lot of sense.
Additionally, there was a really, really nice economic resettlement package that was offered by the international community.
Good point.
And so a lot of people were enticed by that. I know that reintegration programs are often the thing that fails in a DDR system. I'm not saying that this was successful, but the offer at least was very convincing, as it was essentially 2 years of payments as well as training that was offered. Whereas the alternative was, okay, go join a military and you get paid like whatever the wages happen to be. So part of it was definitely that what the soldiers were offered in those assembly areas, one of them was hyped up a lot. And the military option actually received almost no sort of publicity because the military commander sort of assumed that people would want to join and so didn't bother to promote it. And turns out, not so much.
Yeah, it turns out given the option and lucrative being a relative term, okay? Given a more lucrative opportunity to do something else, people don't want to wear the uniform and don't want to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and drill and have to defend something. Makes a lot of sense. So, Colin, anything to add to that conversation, that part?
Just that it reflects the same kind of problems. Well, no, the essential thing about Mozambique that stands out from all the other cases is the incredible deprivation of the entire country at this point, which we've already touched on. The whole country is exhausted, has hardly any resources. There is very little of anything. So in Mozambique, the situation is really, really bad and continues to go downwards. So they start off with a whole lot less, and they get nowhere, and there's no and then we just get into drawing into the patronage and neo-patrimonial accumulation systems, and the armed forces have hardly a chance, and have to be rescued by international force, or have to be supplemented by international forces for all kinds of problems like the floods and so forth much later. So the Mozambique is one of the when you look across the world at these armies reformed in the circumstances of international intervention, Mozambique is one of the absolute worst off, and seems still to have very little hope.
So I think that's a really important point, and that brings together the sort of security bit and the economic bit, right? Because the point I made earlier about Frelimo not being able to pay its own civil servants, unsurprisingly, they also start to have problems paying their new integrated army.
That's never a good sign.
Right. No government wants to be in that position. And so what Frelimo does is they start to pay for the wages that they can pay, they direct towards the Frelimo elements of the integrated army. And so what ends up happening is that this integrated army, suddenly 2/3 of them are getting paid before 1/3 of them are. Additionally, we have that educational problem I mentioned before, where ranks were negotiated out such that someone who had been called a general in Renamo, but had perhaps received no formal military education beyond surviving a civil war, was allowed to keep that title, even though a Frelimo equivalent of a general had probably spent some time in Moscow getting trained. That didn't go over so well with the Frelimo contingent, but that was sort of negotiated out as part of the peace settlement, that everyone got to keep the title, even though how they got there might have been wildly different and their skills might be very different. The problem is that there was no way of fixing that once it got started. So there was no extra training provided for Renamo leaders or foot soldiers. There was no change in the promotion mechanism. And so the integrated military proceeded into the late 90s, early 2000s, but somehow only Frelimo combatants were getting promoted in the institution. Somehow they were the only ones getting properly paid on time. And so even though the military starts off with 1/3 of its members being Renamo, suddenly they all start to retire. Sometimes they come out publicly and say that they were forced to retire. Sometimes they say, well, I had no choice because I wasn't making any money. And sometimes they're like, well, I may as well just take the pension and leave. But whether it was formal or informal, voluntary or coerced, what we end up with is, first, not even the ratio that was agreed upon in the peace treaty, but more importantly, definitely by 2010, there's not a lot of Renamo left in this military. And so it's called integrated, it's called unified, it's called representative, and yet it's not. And so what you end up with today is actually, again, a very similar situation from a Renamo point of view as during the Civil War. You have a government that is still for Frelimo, you have a military that's still for Frelimo, and you have an economic system that still benefits Frelimo. In those circumstances, it's not massively surprising that in Renamo strongholds in the northern part of the country, that people are saying, well, we've tried elections and that's not worked. We've tried cooperating in your military and that's not worked. Maybe our only option is violence.
It's important to mention here that usually in this kind of situation, there is more money around to try and balance out the lack of education from one side of the new integrating army, and the other, the significantly more education. For example, in Sierra Leone, there's been the same kind of issues going on in Liberia, elsewhere in Africa, but here and also in far better off cases like in Bosnia or Kosovo or elsewhere. But here again, the same kind of issues. Mozambique is really at the bottom of the league table.
No, that makes sense. So listen, we're having a fantastic academic discussion. I think this is amazing, but the show isn't anything without an audience. And so I'd like to get a couple comments and questions in from my audience here, guys. Not to interrupt the flow of things. We got a good flow going here, but listen. So we had a question from Strandloper02. I guess he missed out on being Strandloper. Have any of the two guests spent any significant time in Mozambique, traveled along the EN1? Do they know that Nyusi is fluent in Czech from his years in the military college in Brno? I'm sorry, I don't say Brno, I say Brünn because it was an ethnic German town. It was now anyway. So do either of those apply? Do you guys know about those things?
I'm happy to go first.
Go ahead, Miranda, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Miranda. You're the lead on this.
I wish I had spent more time in Mozambique, to be honest. I unfortunately have succumbed to the common academic problems of funding and now pandemic. And those things have inhibited any sort of travel from London, as I'm sure you can imagine. In terms of the educational issue, I think it's important to raise that that's not true of everyone involved. There are pretty important exceptions, both historically and currently. The issues, though, are that there are some systemic educational gaps, and that those have not necessarily been addressed. So that the issue of Renamo versus Frelimo in terms of who has access to what kind of education or experience, that's not to say that every single Frelimo member is super educated and worldly and every Renamo member has just crawled out of the bush. That is definitely not true. However, there's enough of a difference, enough of the time that it's worth mentioning, especially because this kind of discrepancy is actually not necessarily something that we're used to seeing in other African countries, particularly today. We're more used to seeing sort of ideological differences rather than actually having to think about things like education and access. And because I think that speaks to the point Colin just made about Mozambique really not having the same kinds of historical trends around resources and development that even some of its neighbors have had.
Colin.
If I make some comments here, no, my time in Africa has not included Mozambique, which is a real shame. And when I get the chance, I will be definitely there. But I've been trying to figure out how to get there and how to organize myself proper translation for several years. I've been going back and forth to people who might be able to go in with me, all that kind of stuff. Trying to figure out funding. We're all very dependent on funding in the academic type of think tanky world nowadays. It's a real shame. No, Kenya and Somalia and Congo and Liberia. No, but not Mozambique.
No, I think it's worth noting here a couple things. Thank you both of you for that. I have limited physical presence experience in Mozambique myself. Only been there a couple of times, handful of times, and only in the south, only in Maputo and the area south of there, and just barely north of Maputo. So I haven't really been up to Cabo Delgado physically present. But what I would add for our audience here is that one can be well informed and insightful about a place without ever having been there. There are many places, many people have never been around the world, so it's important to share that. Now, here's a kind of a question from the audience that's a little bit off the mark, so we'll shift gears a little bit here. Brett gave a super chat and he said, "Are your guests informed on the Burundi human rights situation? Are they also familiar with Burundi wanting reparations from Germany and Belgium, which they announced about 48 hours ago?" Do you want to address that quickly there, Miranda?
I am familiar with it. I think it's interesting. I wonder if Burundi is going to accept anything Germany comes back with, given what's just happened in Namibia. I wonder if there is anything that either country would accept. And I think that there are some interesting potential parallels around how neighboring countries reacted to Burundi versus what kind of interest neighboring countries are taking in Mozambique now. But I don't necessarily think that the current situation in Mozambique rises to the level of what we've been seeing in Burundi since 2015. And I also don't think that the regional dynamics are necessarily the same. But yeah, I definitely am keeping an eye on Burundi. I think a lot of us should.
Yeah, it's a good comment. So I'll give Colin a chance to get here in a second. Yeah, that's I think your point about the regional interest and the dynamics is very different when it comes to Burundi than is Mozambique. Colin?
I'm certainly aware of the issue. I don't think the scale and nastiness of colonization in Burundi rises to the level of Namibia. The stories of what happened in Namibia are imprinted on the minds of the Herero and will be for centuries to come. But yes, depending on the way you slice it, every state that's ever been colonized by a major Western power could present significant, massive kinds of reparation bills. The Indians, for example, only in the last 3 or 4 years have been saying, "What did you do to India?" It's a bit of a completely worthwhile discussion. Whether there's going to be much money in response is another question.
No, I think it's a good point. Now, I've got an easy question. This is an easy one because it's philosophical and your thoughts for both of you. And then I've got a hard question from one of them. And this is a good one. This is a very good question. So Brett gave another super chat, but he asked the question twice. I didn't miss the first time, Brett, but thank you for the super chat. Brett says, "What do my guests think of Samora Machel?" I think that's a fair question. So Miranda, you want to start first? What are your thoughts on Samora Machel?
To be honest, I think Colin should go first. I feel like I've gone first too many times.
Oh, okay.
Now, you'll have to remind me of who Samora Machel was.
He was the independence era guy who died in a plane crash mysteriously over South Africa in questionable circumstances to this day. So, he was the original liberation era leader of
Frelimo.
Yeah, sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Frelimo, thank you, Frelimo, not Renato.
Oh well, maybe it should have been Frelimo. I'm going to skip because no, I never reached that far back. I was always looking at the early 1990s. So I'm just going to put in one other side excursion, which is another completely missed chance. And in this case, it's in the Central African Republic. In the Central African Republic, we had a leader who went down again in a plane crash, who could have been the one of the best possible leaders the country might have ever had, but was killed. And he was a very, very potentially good leader for the country, but disappeared. And we had the same kinds of wonderful Central African Empire and French interventions that that eventually took the Central African Republic right off the map. Just about literally off the map.
Absolutely.
But no, my specific knowledge doesn't reach that far back.
Hey, Miranda, I'll go first. I'll answer as if I'm a guest too, okay? And then I'll let you get in there, okay? All right, so because Miranda may have a very different view, and it'd be interesting to see where her thoughts are compared to mine. So my view on Samora Machel is very complicated in that I don't think many people outside of his immediate circle fully understood what Samora Machel was about and who he was and what his worldview was. And honestly, I think, I can't prove, but I think based on what I know and the history that being a historian and a political scientist, it comes in handy to have both disciplines, but being a historian of political science, I think that Samora Machel took a Freudian bargain by allying with the Soviet side, the East Bloc, because that's who he had to go to. Yeah. The Portuguese were part of NATO, and they weren't going to get any support from NATO countries like the U.S. or other European countries because their own member in the NATO bloc, they're not going to go counter them. We see it play out elsewhere. But Samora Machel, like many liberation era leaders, took the Freudian, not Freudian, but the Faustian choice. I said Freudian, but the Faustian choice, and went with the East Bloc, and it had consequences. And we see it after the peace settlement in '92, after this long civil war. I don't think at all that Samora Machel and Frelimo were really wedded to Soviet collectivization and communist control of the marketplace and the state owning it. It's just what they inherited because they were inculcated by having experience and training in that part of the world. And they saw the inherent conflict with it. And I think, in my view, that Samora Machel and those folks abandoned that as quickly as they saw it failing after the peace thing. But it's unfortunate he died. I'm not a friend of the big man complex and staying, bless you, and staying power forever. But I think that if Samora Machel had lived a few more years, it might have been very beneficial for Mozambique in the end. That's my view, Miranda. Is it different than yours?
I think some of it's the same. I do think definitely that Frelimo sort of latched onto the Soviets a lot more as a means to an end rather than as an ideological sort of North Star. And I think that has some sort of interesting consequences in terms of how that then went. But I actually think that his death, untimely as it was, might have actually been useful in a way for the trajectory of the party, because what it meant is that Frelimo did not have their one beloved initial leader that had to have power at all costs. And of course, Frelimo does stay in power, but Frelimo stays in power as a party. The actual individual person in charge of it has been historically and systemically less important for Frelimo. And if we compare that with other liberation movements, that's actually not true. And in fact, when you have the original leader sticking around the whole time, that can in some ways create a brittleness to what a party is willing to negotiate around, what is they're willing to compromise around. And as we know, transitioning from liberation movement becoming authoritarian country, whether it's communist or not, transitioning then into multi-party democracy, compromise is necessary. Negotiation is necessary. And I wonder if, untimely as his death was, the fact that Frelimo had already had to figure out how they continue as a party without the one leader to unify around might have actually helped them in a way that, for example, both the MPLA and UNITA in Angola were pretty hampered by the fact that they still had their sort of core leader around. I mean, UNITA really famously was the Savimbi machine. But I don't think that that's just a issue in Angola. I think we actually see this across the continent. And we still see this today around, I mean, Mugabe is a great example, right? There are problems for parties that have one great leader, whether it's great in the sense of charisma, patronage, or good ideas. Sometimes there are issues if they stay around. On the other hand, I do think, I don't think he was a horrible person necessarily. I do think there's a lot we still don't know about what he actually believed. But also in another life, I really hope that Netflix comes out with a series about all of the unexplained leaders that got shot down over African countries in little tiny planes in the Cold War, because there's a lot of them and there's still loads we don't know. And that would be a fabulous Netflix series.
Oh, I think that would be amazing.
Yes, including Dag Hammarskjöld.
Dag Hammarskjöld, I was about to
say. And we've got Habyarimana in Rwanda. Yep. I mean, there's just loads of them and it would be fascinating. So Netflix?
Well, I hope so. With the $20 a month they take out of my pocket for canceling all the programs I like. Anyway, not to digress there, but anyway, no, I think that would be fantastic. The Doc Hammarskjöld thing is still shrouded in mystery to this day, and it's very I think frustrating to not have the facts on that situation. And you would hope that people involved with it got close to going to the graves at this point would disclose and divulge what happened, but we still don't know. But so just to clarify my point, when I said a few more years, I meant like serve one term as president is after the peace is what I meant. I famously have railed against the big man complex of Africa, even for rulers who have done a relatively good job and are perceived well, like Paul Kagame. It's time to move on. It's been too long, and nobody outside of Rwanda knows who's going to succeed, because we don't know any personalities, because guys been about Yovari Museveni. The list goes on and on. We saw it in Angola, we saw it in Cameroon, we see it in Togo. The list goes on and on. It's just crazy. The big man complex is not helpful. I think for generations of Africans to grow up only knowing one leader perpetuates this reverence for personality rather than governance. Just a personal view.
Completely
No,
agreed.
it's a
And
shared
don't get me
view.
started
It's
on
a shared view.
Yes.
Okay.
And
So,
don't get me started on Kagame. I will go on.
yeah, because I mean, look, people,
and then you'd have to get me in that queue too.
and it's only a 6-hour program. We don't have that kind of time. No. No, but seriously, a lot of people who are not particularly following closely with events, I'm not to digress to Rwanda, but just since we've just all touched on it, they look around and go, wow, clean streets, the IT revolution, Volkswagen factory there, people are well behaved, governance is, yeah, but at what cost to freedoms, liberties, and political discourse that is not being discussed? Should we trade our freedoms and liberties for clean streets and a functioning internet? Well, some people would, but I wouldn't argue that that's a good case, I think.
Well, and there's also the fact that Kagame, as early, I believe, as 2010, 2011, when interviewed by Foreign Affairs, for example, would publicly say, oh yeah, I've made Rwanda into the Singapore of Africa. And you're like, okay, hang on a second. Have you ever heard of Lee Kuan Yew? How long was he in power? How long was his party in power? Oh, wait, they're still in power. Like, hang on a second. Being the Singapore of Africa and publicly admitting to that as if it's a good thing.
Shows where you're
at. Some questions should be asked there.
Shows where you're at.
No, well, he was always thinking about the wonderful economic progress he'd made. He probably thought Lee Kuan Yew was a great thing to hold up in terms of the way things should always be done. African reverence for senior people.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to ask the hard question, guys. This is from a little bit ago, and then I'm going to get some more chat while you guys answer this one. Coming up in 1 hour. Are either or both you able to go past 1 hour? I promise I'll keep it under an hour and a half at max. Okay, Miranda's good. Colin, can you hang with us?
I'm happy to do that.
I was going to say, man, it's like not even 8 o'clock at Colin. Nobody's even up in New Zealand. They can't hunt.
No, they're at work. They're arriving at work.
Oh, come on, we know they're all out on kiwi hunts. They're all out hunting kiwis right now. So. Colin knows I love New Zealand, so we're just having a little fun there. But okay, here's the hard question, guys. Okay, so this is from Strant Loper a little while ago, about 10, 15 minutes ago, and he said, question for the guests. Since Cabo Delgado insurgency has never been a Renamo stronghold, how do the guests link the apparent Muslim insurgency as having roots in Renamo? First off, I think you probably want to address whether that's an accurate statement, and I'll repeat it. Since Cabo Delgado insurgency has never been a Renamo stronghold, how do the guests link the apparent Muslim insurgency as having roots in Renamo? And there's probably facts there, but there's also some things that can be unpacked. So who wants to go first?
I'll take that if you like.
Go.
My understanding is that there's not a strong link between Renamo and the Cabo Delgado insurgency. That it's more it's all of these things. Many of these things in Africa, as things develop now, become more and more localized. We see things across the entirety of the country, and that's actually not a full representation. This is more a localized Islamic inspiration rather than any link with Renamo.
All right, thank you, Colin. Miranda?
Okay, I don't entirely agree with that, which speaks to the fact that we still don't know a lot of what's going on. So I think there's kind of two strands here of what's happening in northern Mozambique, and to a degree they're intertwined, but I think there are some amount of separation. So first, in terms of Renamo influence, since the peace agreement, Renamo has never won a national majority. has never won the presidency, and yet has relatively consistently won the mayorship and representation in parliament of the sort of cities that exist in the north, and quite a few of the towns, and in fact has petitioned the central government to allow more autonomy for mayoral positions, which has been rejected. So as much as the north was not necessarily a Renamo stronghold during the war, to some degree, kind of, it has become more of an urban-rural divide rather than a north-south or east-west issue, as it was to a degree during the conflict. And it also, it sort of depends again on kind of which bit of the violence you're focusing on. There has been Renamo, pretty heavily focused Renamo violence since about 2014, which like might be over now. There was a nice big public hug, but public hugs are not always the same thing as lack of violence. And then there's, of course, the sort of al-Shabaab, right? And to what degree there are actually strong links to ISIS is unclear. To what degree the motives are purely based around religion is unclear. So it's not to say that there isn't a Muslim element to the current, especially the last few weeks in Cabo Delgado, but that's not the only lens through which to view what's going on.
All right, that's
absolutely. I would say the first lens is the incredible deprivation of the Mozambican economy. That's the first thing. People will reach for what can give them hope, and that may be Renamo. That may be well. I don't agree. I believe from what I understand that it's more about a localized and Islamic, though not Islamic al-Shabaab in the sense of Somali al-Shabaab. It seems to be a different group because it's gone through different names.
Yep.
But it's more about what do we do that gives us something different or something better from this very, very deprived situation.
And I think there's actually a parallel to be drawn between Frelimo working with the Soviet Union and the current insurgents claiming links to the Islamic State, in that there's a performative element here. There's an aspect to which, one, you get attention from claiming links with a powerful international figure. You maybe get financial help. You maybe get sort of propaganda support. And I think that, you know, the same way that we talked about Faustian bargain with Frelimo and the Soviet Union, whether or not they fully believed all the things, I think actually can be made in terms of a local insurgency around pretty significant local issues that uses things like statements about the Islamic State, to some degree uses religion as ways of sort of organizing and mobilizing, but also of getting attention. And I think that's one of the key grievances, is that massive economic deprivation, and more importantly, massive economic deprivation that's been going on for decades, and yet no one has noticed.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. Folks, you're listening to Chris White, Africa, on the Daba Africa channel here on a special feature with my guest, Miranda Melcher. Whoops, it's the wrong side. I got to do this hand. Miranda Melcher. It's backwards on the screen. So Miranda Melcher up here in the upper left-hand corner, who's in London, and she's a PhD candidate at King's College. And we're talking about Mozambique. And then we've moved to the present contemporary events in Mozambique about Cabo Delgado province. And Dr. Colin Robinson, who is my colleague from New Zealand in the bottom there. And we're just talking about these things. So it's interesting. Let me share this with you guys very quickly, since you talk about economic depredation. So I did a research program many years ago, and I can't say much more about that, but it was about a supposed Muslim-Christian divide and how Malawi was going to descend into terrorism and a conflict, which I didn't believe into. I went and did on-the-ground research, and my conclusions were this is overhyped by media, and it's used by certain politicians to make an argument. And I think that often happens, particularly between Christianity and Islam. A lot of people will look for a boogeyman, and for whatever purposes they'll use it. And I think to some degree what's happening in Cabo Delgado, from my perspective, is it's kind of the boogeyman sort of thing. And as you guys said, people are also looking for support or where you can latch on and lend credibility to your movement or what you're doing. So I don't buy into the fundamentalist approach that what's happening to northern Mozambique. But about 18% of Mozambique's population is Muslim, so it's an important distinction to make. But back in 2011, when I worked at the U.S. Africa Command, I warned folks that there's a coming insurgency in Cabo Delgado province, And I didn't say it was tomorrow. I said it's going to be happening in the next decade. And the reason I said it was for the reason Colin mentioned and Miranda's echoed, is that the extreme economic depredation has not been addressed since 92 in a significant fashion, and people can only put up with this for so long, as well as the absence of infrastructure. My argument all along, and I want you guys to weigh in on this after I finish, is that essentially the government in Maputo doesn't govern Cabo Delgado province in northern Mozambique. Their reach isn't there. They can't even reach it physically effectively. So the tentacles of the central government don't reach up there. And as a consequence, it develops its own way. And when it's neglected, it's not developing. And that was why I predicted there'd be a problem. Now, to be fair, I also predicted that there would be piracy off the coast of Mozambique. And I was right about that. I said it would be soon. It was 4 months later because they were focused on Somalia. And I said, well, those pirates are going to come south. If they keep getting harassed up there, they'll just find a better place. And they did come down to Mozambique. But my issue with this, and I think that's correct, is, and you guys can tell me if you think I'm wrong, is that when you neglect people for this long, people will get frustrated, and the frustration. Now, I'm not one. I hate this. People say poverty is the cause of terrorism and conflict. I disagree with that. If it was, half the world would be in war right now. Everybody would be killing each other because so many people around this planet live in abject poverty. I mean, half the population of Botswana lives on less than $2.60, but you don't see Botswana in a civil war. So my point is that poverty isn't the cause, but it can be a contributing factor, especially when people feel neglected. And I think the neglect is part of this. Am I on or am I off, guys? Miranda shook her head.
I would agree, but take it further.
Well, I left that for you to do, Colin. I left that for you. There's your opportunity.
Right. Well, no. My point is that in pre-colonial Africa, the political groupings weren't mostly about control of territory, our Westphalian Western concepts. They're more about control of people. And when you zoom right forward to the present and you say we've got these 50 odd state governments, very important not to call them national governments, 50 odd governments of states in Africa with little spots around their capitals in many cases. And when you get out to the edges, it's the edges that see all the deprivation. It's the edges that look for other options. It's the edges that are influenced by other places like the Eastern Congo, and it's the edges that often come up with where the insurgencies develop.
I would agree with that, and I would also perhaps controversially say that this is actually not a problem just of post-colonial states. Northern England can make the same claim against London. The Appalachian West Virginia can make the same claim against Washington, D.C.
West Virginia.
Easy. I'm from Appalachia.
There's a claim to be made by some. So there is this sort of center periphery issue. And I think this goes back, Colin, to your earlier point, where this might be a problem that we see in a lot of different countries. Mozambique is unique in that there's just so little to go around, even compared to some of its neighbors and other countries on the continent, that it makes the gaps so much more obvious, and it makes the lack of ability to do anything about it, even just throw money at the problem, just really not a particular option. But I do think that it's about more than poverty. It's also the idea of purposeful neglect, that the poverty, no one's actually trying or reaching out. And whether that's because of logistical
purposeful neglect, not just sort of lack of resource, or my Frelimo before Renamo. Yeah. It's we simply won't bother with the North.
I think that it, for one thing, I actually don't really think it matters whether or not we think it's real.
Yeah,
I think the people actually fighting.
Oh yeah, it's the perception completely.
The perception,
absolutely.
So I think there's a perception that to a degree it is purposeful. Also, because we've seen now natural gas being explored in the north, and so there is visible evidence to people living there of, wait a second, the government is interested in us for the stuff they can extract. And yet we're not getting jobs out of that. We're not getting the...
On top of 30 years of no resources and the Portuguese just stealing everything they could find, that would be enough to get anybody excited.
It's not, I think it's not just the question of, and I think that explains to a degree why we see this now. If the economic deprivation's been there for 20, 30 years, why is it now? And I think part of it is saying, hang on a second, when you were down south and dealing with your own stuff and kind of left us to our own devices, that's one thing. Right? The whole country is to a degree deprived. But if you're coming up and taking our natural gas and we're not seeing a dime of that, that becomes, I think, a very different thing when we talk about perception of purposeful neglect versus national poverty.
No, yeah. I think those are great points. I think that I'm really glad that we had that part of it, because the three of us kind of teased that out and really brought out. And Miranda, I think you brought it to the fore, is that not just neglect, but the perception of purposeful neglect is what really contributes to this. But again, it's not just Mozambique. It can be a lot of places around the world where, I don't know, it's the heartland, rimland theory. Gosh, this sort of sounds familiar. I'm having fadebacks to graduate programs here and undergraduate programs. But anyway, so yeah, that's interesting. Now, there's another question here, folks, that I'd like you to take a stab at. And that was that. Now, this is not related to Mozambique, but I think this is fascinating. Of course, it's subjective. So let's see if we each come up with the same country or what we come up with. So, Proudly Neanderthal asked questions to the guests: which SADC country is the most corrupt? I think that's a good question.
Ooh. There are so many potential contenders.
That's the sad part.
So
that's
many potential answers.
That's the sad part.
God save us. I've got two thoughts.
Go ahead.
Well, my first thought now, if corruption is connected to the amount of wealth available, then we've got to say South Africa.
Okay.
Also, if corruption is a function of inherent malice, then you can't go past the crocodile in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
Those were exactly my two answers.
Okay, my answer would be, let me look at it historically, and then I'll come contemporary. Historically, I would say in Southern Africa and the SADC region, it would have to be Angola that was the worst when it came to corruption.
Yes, that was the other one in my mind.
Historically. But since the, let's say, new dispensation, since the Dos Santos have been getting marginalized under the new, I don't want to say regime, because I want to think of them favorably for the moment, but the new governance in Angola, I think I don't know if it's simply removing a faction and strengthening another faction, or it's genuine rooting out. I'm hoping it's so, but we'll just say, historically, I would say it was Angola. They perfected, state capture before anyone even used the term in Central Asia or attributed it to South Africa. In the contemporary context, I think that it doesn't get any more corrupt than Zimbabwe's ZANU-PF, which has been perfecting this since the late 1980s for sure. They were dipping their hands in the till from 1980 on, but ever since they switched over in the late 80s, changed their government, they perfected. Mnangagwa was taken to levels that are unseen now in that whole faction. And South Africa has gone from petty corruption, in which they imprisoned Tony Yengeni for taking a discount for purchasing a Mercedes-Benz. That was a corrupt practice, which that's almost embarrassing how juvenile that kind of corruption is, to just wholesale theft. I mean, they're stealing funds from relief funds. People are donating money to help South Africans, and they're stealing it and getting away with it. No one's prosecuted. No cases are brought forward. Just assurances that the African National Congress is investigating. Well, thank you so much. Jacob Zuma hasn't been brought to the docket. The arms case in Kandla, Oilgate, Travelgate, all the stuff goes on and on. So I would agree with you guys that Zimbabwe and South Africa are the two candidates today for the most corrupt in SADC. I think we reached agreement on that.
Now, Chris, just to turn that round for half a second.
Sure.
And Miranda, you'll have some. You might have some thoughts. Was there a chance for South Africa in the early 1990s? Was there any hope of diverting from the usual "we're an independent Black African country" in 1960 model that might have led it away from this corrupt mess it's gotten? Was there any hope? Was there something different that could have been done?
Well, absolutely. I agree there was. And I think there was a path that was on the right path. But the problem is that, because in my view, and now this is going to upset some of my audience, and that's fine. This is my view. In my view, there were legitimate, honest, patriotic, dedicated, loyal South Africans in the African National Congress, some of whom actually contributed to the liberation struggle. Not like a lot of them take credit and never did anything as they hid out in London, but some who actually contributed to the struggle. And I think the ANC actually, despite a lot of challenges, was on a decent path at the outset and changing some things. So, for instance, most South Africans weren't paying taxes, and those entering the workforce were getting away with not paying taxes. But under Trevor Manuel, they actually brought about 1 million new people into the tax rolls, and tax compliance increased, and revenue increased. And that money was used to build houses and extend the electric grid. The problem is that they tolerated corruption, and it's our turn to eat, to take a line from Michaela Wrong. Our turn to eat philosophy, and that became entrenched. It became so bad that in KwaZulu-Natal, instead of aspiring to be a fireman or a doctor or a farmer or a soldier or a lawyer or somebody to contribute to society or a teacher, you have young South Africans who aspire to be ANC cadres so that they can bump off the other ANC cadre and assassinate them so that they can get their hands on the tenders and steal money from that. So in other words, instead of aspiring to be a contributory member of society, people aspire to be public part of the government because that's the path to wealth. And that's the path a lot of African countries went on, which bothers me. But no, I don't think that this was predestined. I will say this, though. There were troubling signs from the outset. And the troubling signs for me, and I say this back in the 90s when I was still a young guy, is that it seemed like the ANC was all too comfortable to adopt a lot of the things that were in place that the National Party had there. Now, this is really going to get some people triggered, but let me finish, guys, real quick. So what I say oftentimes is that the ANC and the National Party are not that different. I mean, hang on. They're not that different. By the end of the National Party's reign, they were essentially a security state, and the country was run by the head of the intelligence, the military, the police, and the presidency. They ran it. The parliament was a rubber stamp. It had very little impact on politics in South Africa at that stage. They decided what was done, what conflicts were fought, where money went, what things were done, where the spoils went. They also had a system of parastatals, whether it was by desire or at a necessity for like Denel for arms or Sasol for producing energy. They had a system of that. And they had a system of patronage. That system of patronage favored overwhelmingly Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans. All of that's true. The ANC rolls in and go, oh, I like this. Now, maybe not intentionally at first, but they're quite comfortable with patronage. They're quite comfortable with cozy state parastatal things. And I think that all the elements for the crisis we have in South Africa today were already in place. It just took a time for this to become the norm in South Africa. But it has been the norm for over a decade. The world just thinks it's April 27th, 1994, and it's not, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I'll pause there.
No, indeed.
Nothing to add to that. Coherent, agree.
Okay, cool.
Also, not my expertise. So,
that's always
from what I know, that all makes sense.
I should bring more guests in that don't know some topic that I know specific about, so I look really smart. That's a good ploy. I'll have to do that in the future. All right, let me shift the gears a little bit there. Just kidding, guys, but let me shift gears a little bit. Thank you for the question, Colin. It's interesting we all agreed on exactly who the ones are the most trouble right now. I'm trying to find where this question was. It was a really good one here. That's a comment, not a question. What I do is I copy these. Oh, yeah, Brett was asking a question about albinos. I don't know if you guys know much about this, but in many countries in East Africa, albinos are harassed. They're murdered. They're eaten by some people. It's very sickening stuff, but albinos have a history of being harassed in northern Mozambique. Is that still a problem in Mozambique? I'm pretty sure it is.
To my knowledge, it is, but Mozambique has not traditionally been the center of where those problems have been either the most significant, but of course we also have to wonder about what's being reported to whom.
It's a serious.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely an issue and a problem in Kenya. Almost certainly in Tanzania, but the information doesn't get out of Tanzania in a wonderful way. Yeah. And yes, I'd pick up Miranda's point. What's getting reported to whom? There are some albinos who are probably doing well in their extended family. There are other albinos who would be getting thoroughly worked over.
No, and I think we've all hit on the spot. Tanzania is where I'm familiar with this being the biggest problem. I mean, people kidnapped and then murdered and eat them. It's anyway. Let's move on from that topic. So Brett gave a super chat, and this is more apropos to the topic today. Thank you for the super chat, Brett. What are the current relations between Portugal and Mozambique like? Do most Mozambicans still hate the Portuguese and blame Portugal for their problems? I don't know if the second part of that's entirely accurate. Some do, but I think a lot of them but anyway, Miranda, you want to go first?
So I was actually really interested in this, particularly when I look at Angola and Mozambique. And something that was interesting to me is the first peace treaty in Angola was actually negotiated in Portugal. And it was funded, the negotiations were funded and sort of hosted by the Portuguese. The Mozambican negotiations were hosted by the Italians, and the Portuguese actually offered to take them on and were turned down. The reasons given were more that the negotiations had already started and no one wanted to disrupt them. But I think there is something interesting there. I think to a degree it's worth considering what Portugal's feelings about Mozambique are. It's a two-way street. And from what I've seen, given that both Angola and Mozambique and Portugal's other former colonies now trade in export-based economies, Portugal's been a lot more interested and a lot more involved in Angola than in Mozambique. I don't think that's an accident. Angola has a lot of oil. Mozambique does not. So from what I've seen, first, yeah, I wouldn't say that it's a massively widespread belief of Mozambicans walking around going, we hate the Portuguese, they're evil. Don't really think that's particularly a thing today, given especially that, as with many countries in the global south, the average age is certainly young enough that most people are not remembering life under colonialism. Yeah. And so I don't think that's necessarily an accurate representation. I do think that Portugal, I mean, as we know, Portugal has had a whole bunch of economic problems of its own lately. Yeah. And therefore, it is sort of both sides of this have to be interested and involved. And I think for various reasons, neither has necessarily felt like that's the relationship they really need to rekindle. But I don't think it would be fair to say that that's from some sort of continued, deeply felt hatred.
Cool beans. Colin, anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add to that. I've not been following that at all.
Well, I was going to say that's not been my experience. My experience in Mozambique is, along what Miranda says there, is that most Mozambicans, very few have a memory of the Portuguese. Very few have any antagonism towards them, whether it's deserved or not. It's just not something that comes up on the radar screen. And also, we should mention this. I mean, while Portuguese is the official language of Mozambique, barely 25% of Mozambicans speak any degree of proficiency in Portuguese. It's not like you can go all around the country and speak Portuguese, because it just doesn't work. You might have been able to do that at one point where people at least understood you because they heard Portuguese, overlords or colonial folks there. But they've been gone for so long, and so few people speak it on a daily basis, the proficiency is pretty low across the country.
There's also sort of two additional points. Yeah. First of all, Mozambican Portuguese is very much its own dialect of Portuguese. So that's a kind of an important thing as well. But also, unlike some of Portugal's other former colonies, Mozambique did not actually fight a total war of independence in the same sort of way. There was violence, there was fighting, but it wasn't. If Mozambicans are remembering conflict and remembering devastation, it's the civil war long after the Portuguese left that really has those indelible memories, not conflict with Portugal itself. And that's not true of other former colonial powers, even Portugal, where the independence struggle was really nasty and protracted. But in Mozambique's particular case, the independence war wasn't as bad compared to the massive devastation of the civil war that came after, that Portugal was not involved with.
Interesting. Now, a couple of my viewers, our viewers for the stream, have chimed in a couple of times, said Mozambique really ought to focus on tourism. There was an effort to focus on tourism there for a while, especially tourism from South Africa. That's a long-held tradition from a lot of people from Gauteng and from Mpumalanga who drive down to go fishing and bathing on the beaches of Mozambique, which are famously quite nice. And some people don't like this reference, but they have prawns in Mozambique, and they're huge. And I always say they're the size of a baby's arm, and people are like, ew, that's gross. But the point is that they're quite large for prawns. But so a few of the folks in the chat have been saying they should focus on tourism, but that's a little difficult to do in the midst of COVID-19 and also underdeveloped infrastructure and governance challenges.
Well, and also it wouldn't necessarily solve the fundamental problem, right? That because of how Mozambique is physically, the geography of the country is the coast is where more of the development has historically been. Yeah. And so if we're talking about a fundamental disconnect between urban and rural areas, developing a beach-based tourist economy actually doesn't really help that.
Yeah, no, gotcha. That's absolutely true. So there's a few more things in the chat here we'll get to before we wrap up. Let me see. Someone's asking, I think they're trying to get us to say that there's wholesale farm killings in South Africa. I've talked about rural killings in South Africa and rural security, but I'm not going to focus on that one. We can talk about that in another stream. And this was in response to me. Someone was making the point that Strandloper said that while the National Party certainly had a loyalty system, they put a high value on competence and ability to do the job. Well, that's true. Absolutely. I've not disputed that. That's one significant difference between the ANC's patronage system and the National Party's patronage system. By and large, not entirely, but by and large, the National Party's patronage system put competent, qualified people in position, whereas the ANC puts loyalty over competence. That's true. And also someone commented about that it's not Afrikaners, it was National Party cadre. Yes, but I think you'd be hard pressed to make a legitimate argument against me to say that, well, yeah, the National Party put loyalty and competent people in place, and so it wasn't Afrikaners. Well, you didn't see too many Xhosa, Zulu, Venda, Tswana, Siswati speakers who were in positions of power during that government.
How many of the blacks ended up in the South African government before 1994?
Well,
not many.
That's kind of the
unless
point
you were
I'm
running
making.
a township.
That's kind of the point I'm making here. So, but there is one interesting point here, guys. I want to get a chance to give you all, because I don't want to keep you here forever. We're going to wrap up here shortly. But this was one that Rudy said a little while ago, and it kind of resonates with me. And I've seen this across Africa. As long as populations remain uneducated, and I would add to that critically thinking, learn critical thinking skills, African leaders can do as they please. I don't think that's an unfair statement. What, you guys, any comments on that?
I think that's fair, but I think that we also need to think about the critical thinking skills of the international donors who
oh, yeah, sure,
often think that some of these people are good. I mean, Mugabe and the crocodile, I mean, those are obvious examples that the West has quite easily been able to say, oh, yeah, no, we're not doing that. But the Kagame point earlier, I mean, again, like just a simple comparison, you look at the numbers, for example, for HIV/AIDS in Rwanda and Burundi from the very beginning of HIV/AIDS numbers being tracked, and they're pretty much the same. The numbers are about the same, the infection rates are about the same, and yet the three main international organizations from the West that give aid, the Clinton Foundation, PEPFAR, and I'm completely blanking on the third name.
Millennium,
Bill and Melinda Gates.
Yeah, Gates, that's the one, yeah.
Yeah. Two of the three don't actually operate in Burundi, but they do in Rwanda, even though there's the same number of people and the same kind of infection rates and the same kind of geography. So, the Clinton Foundation, we've seen over and over again, is the Clintons personally are good friends, it seems, of Kagame. So I think that the critical thinking piece, we can go back to the IMF being like, yay, we've rebuilt the Mozambican economy. Oh, whoops, most people are still really poor.
Yeah.
I think the critical thinking point is a really valid one in terms of allowing dictatorships and dictators to kind of do whatever. But I don't think that stops with local African politicians. I think that there is a responsibility on those of us who pay taxes to big Western governments, not necessarily just Western, the Japanese as well, but big governments that give a lot of foreign aid, to be a lot more critical and to honestly, to just pay more attention. I cannot tell you, I went to university in America, and one of the reasons I was not necessarily interested in going and doing graduate studies in the States was I was told over and over again, oh, well, we don't really pay attention to Africa. And well, there's 54 UN recognized countries in Africa. There's rather a lot of the world's population. So I think
doesn't make money.
So I think that education and critical thinking are really important, but I don't think that the responsibility is solely on Africans. I think that the West and the developed world in general allow sort of too much to pass uncommented.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair comment, Miranda. Absolutely. I agree with that wholeheartedly. There's responsibility for the world. It's not just Africa, because Africa's part of the world and there's interaction in there. And depending on what you do, you can be enabling bad behavior. Famously, as a consequence of the Cold War and the proxy situation, the U.S. government gave Mobutu money for decades because he kept things quiet, and we had access to bases that we needed during the Cold War in the Congo, in Zaire. And so, yeah, it's all kinds of responsibility there for folks outside the region as well. Colin, any comment on that?
Completely, absolutely. Both the problem, half the problem is the setup of the education system. If we don't even do it brilliantly in the West in some cases. Critical thinking has got to be developed through different ways of thinking about issues. But the other issue, as Miranda, I would completely support, is we import what we call in academia the liberal piece. We import this complete idea that the whole of the world can look like London or Lords or Manchester or Marseille or Minneapolis
or Wellington.
It doesn't necessarily. Well, Minneapolis is another story right now. But anyway, there's no rule that says that we're all going to get there. They have different ways of doing things and different approaches and different chances to achieve their own agency, to get to their own destiny, which doesn't necessarily look like us. But on the other hand, they're all people, they're all men, women, and children with wishes, like not to be infected with HIV/AIDS. So where do you draw the boundary? Where do you draw the line between saying they should be able to do what they wish, especially important from a small country Kiwi perspective, a small country perspective, something like Malawi or Mozambique, as opposed to South Africa or Angola or Sudan, and the wish for everybody is to have a safe, happy, prosperous life.
Excellent. Okay, let me ask you guys one more question, and I'm going to come back. I'm going to go in reverse order. We'll start with Miranda with the question, and then Colin, and then I'm going to say something, and then I'm going to give you guys a chance to have a final say, and then I'm going to put you in the waiting room. We're going to close out the stream. Now, this is about South Africa, and I know, Miranda, that's not your subject matter expertise necessarily, but maybe you follow the issue. If you don't have to comment on it. But one of my guests is ask a question. A few others ask it. The rural violence, the farm killings that are taking place in South Africa. Are you aware of that, or do you have any view on that? And then I'll ask Colin.
I'm aware of it, but I wouldn't say I know enough to have a particularly useful view.
All right, that's cool. Thanks a lot, Miranda. Any comments, Colin? It's also not in your bailiwick with South Africa, but maybe you know a little bit about it. I'm not sure.
I'm going to skip that one.
Okay.
You really want to comment? I'm sure. No, you're keeping an eye on that one, so you can say some things.
I will not. I've talked about it extensively on my channel and do videos about it. But I will say this concept is that I'm different than most people that talk about it, in that I talk about it's a rural insecurity issue in South Africa, and it affects everyone in South Africa, white, black, colored, and Indian. And some people paint it as it's only whites being targeted, and some whites are being targeted, and there is political violence. Some of it's crime of opportunity. But the whole situation is horrific for everybody in South Africa, and it's dangerous. It's caustic to society. So I'll leave it there. So Colin, listen, guys, it's an hour and 30 minutes, and we probably do this all day. I have a feeling. So Miranda's got evening, my South African audience, which is a fair portion of the audience. It's late in the evening there. So what I'd like to do is, Colin, give you a chance. Anything you want to talk about Mozambique or that we've covered, or you want to discuss here real quickly, give you a chance to wrap up for a couple minutes, and then I'll give Miranda the same thing. Then I'll put you guys in the waiting room. And if you don't mind waiting for a couple minutes in the waiting room while I wrap up the stream, and I'll just touch base with you guys for a post-cut sort of thing. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to squiz away entirely and briefly make an advert for something that people should be watching, but is not on the continent of Africa. I'm sure you've all heard of the situation developing in Belarus, where they've had 26 years of an increasingly nasty dictator who was not really probably properly elected the first time, in which there was one election that was seen as free and fair back in 1994, but now we have a situation where there have been 7, 8, 9 elections and the people have gotten nowhere. Now, there has been a significant rising up. There's been 10 days worth of protests. And from what I see in the last several hours, what happened in Crimea with little green men, or if you want to call them from the Russian perspective, polite people, that is Russian special forces, may be beginning to turn up in the eastern side of Belarus, or as far as Minsk. So that's another situation where not an African revolution, but the kind of revolution we saw in South Africa in 1990, in the early 1990s, in the same kinds of risings, the same kinds of popular revolt we've seen in Sudan, for example, is happening, and people are trying to make a difference in their own lives.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks. Belarus was an interesting diversion there, a little away from Mozambique. Miranda, anything you want to wrap up, or points we might not have had a chance to cover as we talk about these issues?
I would say, kind of relatedly, 2 other things to keep an eye on. Obviously, what's happened in Mali in the past 24 hours has been quite interesting, though part of a trend. And then also the continued whatever is going on in Ethiopia, I think is worth paying attention to, particularly as we've just had a massive change in cabinet. That's, I think, in a lot of ways, there are some really important parallels to situations we've seen elsewhere in Africa historically and more recently, and are maybe not things we're necessarily used to thinking about for Ethiopia, that are worth kind of keeping an eye on, even though the government is seeming to do a relatively good job of keeping it mostly out of the headlines. And then in Mozambique in particular, I'd say that, that if I could make no other point, it would be two things. First, that it is about local issues, and that as much as it's easy to read headlines that talk about ISIS linked or Al-Shabaab, but no, not the Somali one, or, oh, it's about religion. I think the importance of local grievances really cannot be overstated in this particular case, especially. And secondly, that, I'm a massive peace treaty nerd. That's quite literally what my research is on. But in this case, I think that's warranted, right? The actual things that were written down in 1992, and importantly, the things that were not written down in 1992, are actually still live issues today, despite the fact that I think a lot of the people perhaps holding the guns on both sides maybe weren't alive then, maybe weren't adults and cognizant then. But these documents and these agreements, and particularly the perceptions of what these agreements were and were not, is, I think, fundamental to understanding Mozambique today, both in terms of current events in Cabo Delgado, but also kind of more generally what is either happening or stagnating in the country.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate both of you guys coming on the channel and contributing. By the way, Colin, thanks for linking us together. So we have Miranda on here. Great perspectives on the topic of Mozambique. And I think it was important, and appreciate, Miranda, that you helped us set the stage historically how we got to where we're at today, because you can't just walk in and go, oh, there's a mess here. Well, you got to understand that there is some history to it. It does contribute to the situation. So thank you both for that. And I'll extend an invitation. Maybe we'll get you guys come back on the channel again in the future. Colin's his second time appearance, but Miranda, you were a rookie, but you're welcome back on the channel if you like at some point. And thank you both for your presence today.
Thank you.
Cheers.
All right, guys, if I could ask you to, or maybe I can get you to into the waiting room. If you don't mind hanging around for about 5 minutes, just leave your camera on, and I'll come back and talk to you guys once I go off air, okay? So I'm going to put you in the waiting room, okay? And Colin gets you in the waiting room. There we go. Okay, now it's just me. All right, folks. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning into the stream today. I hope that you found it interesting. But let me just cover something here really quickly here, because I see some comments in the chat here, not wanting to talk about farmers. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a stream about farm murders in South Africa. The title of the stream is very clear. It's about what's happening in Mozambique. The events in Mozambique do not have much bearing on rural insecurity and the murder of white South Africans on farms in South Africa. I don't think that's fair to ask my guests to comment on that. They were very generous in talking about other situations, like delving into Tanzania and Burundi and Angola, and also even Belarus there at the end, which was interesting. But that's not on my guest. You're asking questions that are unrelated to that. That'd be like me putting on a rugby game and asking people questions about badminton. That's not fair. I invited in subject matter experts on Mozambique and on security. Miranda, a subject matter expert on Mozambique, and Colin, a subject matter expert on security in Africa. And so we talked about that. We talk endlessly about farm murders and rural insecurity on my channel, and you guys know that. So I'm not sure why people are saying that no one was willing to address it, because this wasn't the topic. Anyway, so I do thank folks for tuning in. I appreciate it. And as I've said, one of the reasons why I do this channel is I try to convince American businesses and American governance to be more interested in Africa, because as I've pointed out repeatedly, and now it seems like a lot of people are on this bandwagon, but I've been doing it for several years, Africa today, 1.3 billion people, Africa in the year 2050, which hopefully is still in my lifetime, will be a country, or a continent, a continent of 2.3 to 2.5 billion people, regardless of what happens to birth rates between now and then. This is cooked in. It's going to happen. And we'll have a economic class of consumers with disposable income somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 million people, at least, which is 3 times the current size of the entire United States. It's certainly far larger than our current consumer class. Now, consumers in Africa in 2050 won't be as wealthy or as well off as consumers in America, Europe, or maybe even China at that stage, but they'll certainly have disposable income, and they'll want to buy things. And it's to the mutual benefit of the United States and to African countries that we work together to build business relations and ties and links. And so that's one of my reasons for the focus on Africa. Anyway, folks, that's kind of what I want to say. Thanks a lot for tuning in. I appreciate it. I really appreciate the super chats and also the comments and the contribution to the discussion. This will take the place of the the night stream. I might just go on a little bit just to come back on and give people a chance to ask some questions about the farm murders. If you want to do that, we can talk about that. I've talked about that a lot in this channel, but that wasn't the focus of the stream. So thanks a lot, folks, for tuning in. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure having you here on the channel. It's our second stream for the day, and God bless. Remember, tomorrow on the channel at noon Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. in Botswana and South Africa, Unati Kwaza will be back on the channel. That's right. And our very own Brett Sessoms will be on here for the evening program tomorrow. The Night Owl edition will be a special feature instead of a Night Owl edition of Stray Voltage with Brett Sessoms. And he's going to tell us why he finds Africa so interesting and fascinating. Of course, he's the famously American from the Deep South, and he'll be talking to us tomorrow. And then on Saturday, a lot of people should be excited about this. I have Des Palm from the Cape Exit Movement looking for independence for the Western Cape. So that'll be on Saturday. Folks, thanks a lot. God bless. I appreciate being here. I will do a short version of the Night Owls edition. I haven't posted yet. Look for the link after I get offline, and I'll come back and we'll talk for a little bit and answer any questions. And if 3 or 4 people show up, it will be very short. If 40 or 50 people show up, maybe it'll go a little bit longer. All right, folks, thanks a lot. The Right Reverend wanted to zoom in. Okay, what I'll do is the Right Reverend, since you guys are around here, I won't announce it. I'll open up my camera as a Zoom, and I'll make the link so people can call in, okay? That's what we'll do after this. It won't be a long time, but you get a chance to call in. You don't get 20 minutes. You get a couple minutes, okay? All right, folks, thanks a lot. God bless. Appreciate you tuning in to Chris White Africa today. And thanks to my guests for their contributions. Really appreciate it. I'm going to close out now, and we will be back just a short while after this, okay? I'll be back shortly after this. All right, folks, thanks a lot. God bless, and we'll see you guys in a little. Oh, hang on a second. My camera's not moving. There we go. There we go. Okay, folks, thanks. Take care.